The day I found out someone had my tenant's truck towed from my own property, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. By the end of that year, I owned the towing company that had taken it. And if you're already thinking that sounds insane, trust me, that's exactly what I thought too. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for almost a decade, I owned a commercial office building in downtown Springfield, Missouri. It wasn't some flashy skyscraper or luxury development, just a solid brick building with reliable tenants, good cash flow, and something that was becoming increasingly valuable every year: parking. Anyone who owns commercial real estate in a growing downtown area knows that parking spaces can be worth almost as much as the building itself. I had 10 dedicated spaces behind my building, clearly marked with large metal signs that read reserved for tenants only. Those spots weren't just convenient. They were part of what kept my tenants renewing their leases year after year. For nearly 9 years, I never had a single issue. Then the building next door sold. The buyers were a married couple named Ethan and Lauren Whitmore. They had recently moved from Seattle and had built a reputation as aggressive investors. They bought the neighboring property in cash, closed the deal in less than 3 weeks, and immediately began renovating it into some kind of co-working and startup incubator space. The first time I met Ethan, he seemed perfectly friendly. We shook hands in the alley behind our buildings while construction crews were unloading materials. He smiled, complimented the neighborhood, talked about bringing fresh energy into the area. Honestly, I wanted to like him. Downtown business owners survive by maintaining decent relationships with each other. Before leaving, I even pointed toward the parking lot and explained where our property line ran. I specifically remember saying, "These 10 spots belong to my building. My tenants use them every day." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Got it," he said. "No problem." Looking back, I sometimes replay that conversation in my head. Maybe he was already planning something. Maybe he wasn't. But 3 weeks later, everything changed. It started with a phone call from one of my tenants, a woman named Melissa. Melissa had leased office space for me for almost 5 years and ran a small accounting firm. She was calm by nature, which is why hearing panic in her voice immediately got my attention. "Daniel," she said, "my truck is gone." At first, I thought it had been stolen. I grabbed my keys and drove downtown. When I arrived, Melissa was standing in the parking lot staring at the empty space where her truck had been parked that morning. There was no broken glass, no evidence of theft, just a bright orange towing notice stuck to the asphalt. I picked it up and read the company name: Iron Ridge Recovery Services. The notice said the vehicle had been removed due to unauthorized parking and could be reclaimed for $450. I called the number immediately. A man named Carl answered. He sounded tired, like someone who had spent 20 years dealing with angry people. "Your company towed my tenant's truck from private property," I said. "I own that property." There was a pause. Then Carl replied, "We received authorization from the property owner. I am the property owner." Another pause. This one longer. Finally, he said, "The authorization came from Ethan Whitmore." I remember feeling completely stunned. Ethan Whitmore doesn't own that lot. Carl sounded genuinely confused. He showed us documentation and said those spaces belonged to his building. My stomach sank. Melissa was standing next to me, watching my expression change. "What is it?" she asked. I looked at her and said, "I think our new neighbor just had your truck towed from my property." 20 minutes later, I called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Daniel. Like your friends. Like nothing had happened. You had my tenant's vehicle towed." There was a brief silence, then a chuckle. Not nervous laughter, not embarrassment. The kind of laugh someone gives when they think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. "We needed additional parking for our contractors," he said. "Lauren thought some of those spaces belonged to us." "They don't." "Well, your signs looked old." Honestly, it wasn't that big a deal. She can just pay the fee and get her truck back. I felt my blood pressure rise immediately. Not because of the money, because of the arrogance. $450 wasn't going to bankrupt anyone. But the idea that someone could take control of property they didn't own and then act like I was overreacting was infuriating. "Those spaces are legally attached to my building," I told him. "You'll reimburse my tenant, and this stops now." His tone changed instantly. The friendliness disappeared. "Our survey says the boundary line is different than what you're claiming." Then your survey is wrong. Maybe, he said calmly. Maybe not. Feel free to discuss it with our attorney. Then he hung up. I stood there staring at my phone. For a few seconds, I honestly couldn't believe the conversation had happened. Melissa finally broke the silence. What are you going to do? I looked across the alley toward Ethan's building. Construction crews were moving in and out. Contractors were laughing. Everything looked normal. But something had shifted. What started as a parking dispute suddenly felt like a challenge. And if there was one thing I had learned during years in business, it was that people who casually ignore boundaries rarely stop on their own. They only stop when someone forces them to. That afternoon, I called the one person I trusted to tell me the truth, whether I liked the answer or not. His name was Robert Gaines. And for nearly 30 years, he had been one of the most respected property attorneys in the city. I scheduled a meeting for the next morning, gathered every document I had, and drove home wondering whether I was dealing with an honest misunderstanding or the opening move in a much larger fight. The next morning, I walked into Robert Gaines' office carrying a banker box full of property records, surveys, title documents, site plans, and enough paperwork to make most people fall asleep on site. Robert had been practicing real estate law longer than I'd owned my building, and one thing I appreciated about him was that he never rushed to conclusions. He spent nearly 2 hours reviewing everything while I sat across from his desk, watching him turn page after page. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, removed his reading glasses, and looked directly at me. "Daniel," he said, "there's nothing ambiguous about this." I felt a wave of relief. Meaning those parking spaces belong to your property. Period. He pulled out the original plat map and laid it across his desk. The boundary line isn't even close to where Whitmore is claiming it is. Whoever told him otherwise is either mistaken or hoping you'll back down. That last part stuck with me. Hoping you'll back down. Because the more I thought about Ethan's attitude, the more it felt intentional. He wasn't confused. Confused people apologize when presented with facts. Ethan had doubled down. Robert drafted a formal demand letter that afternoon. It was professional, direct, and left little room for interpretation. It demanded reimbursement for Melissa's towing fees, immediate cessation of any interference with my property rights, and written confirmation that the conduct would not continue. I expected the situation to end there. I was wrong. A week later, Ethan's attorney responded. The letter was filled with legal language attempting to create uncertainty where none existed. They claimed there were unresolved questions regarding boundary interpretation. They suggested both parties might share responsibility. Then they offered what they described as a reasonable compromise. They wanted to split the towing costs. I actually laughed when Robert handed me the letter. Split the costs? I asked. For towing a vehicle from my own property? Robert nodded. That's their position. Then file the lawsuit. He didn't hesitate. I was hoping you'd say that. Looking back, that was probably the moment the dispute officially transformed into a war. Because once the lawsuit was filed, Ethan stopped pretending to be cooperative. He became openly aggressive. Over the following 6 weeks, something strange started happening. Every time one of my tenants parked in their assigned spaces, there seemed to be a risk their vehicle would disappear. At first it happened once, then twice, then again. Iron Ridge Recovery Services would show up within hours and tow the vehicle away. Every single time, the justification was the same. Unauthorized parking. Every single time, the vehicle had been parked on my property. I spent countless afternoons driving frustrated tenants to the towing yard, helping them recover their vehicles, reimbursing fees out of my own pocket, and apologizing for a situation I hadn't created. One tenant threatened to terminate her lease. Another asked whether the parking dispute would affect her employees. A third simply looked exhausted and said, "Daniel, I know this isn't your fault, but I can't keep dealing with this." Those conversations hurt more than the financial losses. Money can be replaced. Trust is harder. Every time one of my tenants questioned whether they should remain in my building, I felt like Ethan was accomplishing exactly what he wanted. One afternoon, I called him again. I still remember standing in the parking lot while making that call. 2 contractor vans from his building were parked halfway across my spaces. Ethan answered with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "What now?" he asked. You're still using my parking lot. According to our survey, it's shared space. Your survey is wrong. Then let the judge decide. I took a breath. You've already cost my tenants thousands of dollars. Sounds like a legal issue. You're doing this intentionally. He laughed. Prove it. Then he hung up. Again, I stared at my phone and realized something important. The lawsuit would eventually solve the legal problem, but lawsuits move slowly. Courts have schedules. Discovery takes time. Hearings get postponed. Months can pass before a final ruling arrives. Ethan understood that. He was using the delay itself as a weapon. Every week that passed gave him more free parking and created more pressure on my tenants. That's when I started thinking differently. Instead of focusing on Ethan, I started focusing on the towing company. Iron Ridge wasn't creating the conflict. They were simply participating in it. And participation often depends on incentives. A few days later, I drove to their office. It wasn't much to look at. A small industrial property on the edge of town with a gravel lot, 2 tow trucks, and a faded sign hanging over the entrance. Carl recognized me immediately. Here to yell at me again? He asked with a grin. Actually, no. He looked surprised. Then what can I do for you? We ended up talking for almost an hour. Not about lawsuits. Not about Ethan. Just business. Carl turned out to be far more approachable than I expected. As the conversation continued, he became increasingly honest about the challenges he faced. Insurance costs had increased. Fuel prices were unpredictable. Maintenance expenses seemed endless. Several municipal contracts had recently expired. Some months were profitable. Others barely broke even. Eventually, I asked a question that made him stop talking. Have you ever thought about selling? He stared at me for several seconds. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it seemed absurd. You serious? Maybe. Why would you want a towing company? I shrugged. Diversification. He laughed again. That's a fancy word for buying headaches. We exchanged numbers before I left. I honestly wasn't sure whether anything would come from the conversation. But over the next couple weeks, we spoke several more times. The more I learned about Iron Ridge, the more I realized Carl was exhausted. He had spent nearly 20 years building the business and was reaching a point where the stress no longer felt worth it. One evening, he called me unexpectedly. You still interested? He asked. Possibly. Come by tomorrow. So I did. We sat in a small office, surrounded by filing cabinets and maintenance records. Carl showed me financial statements, contracts, equipment inventories, employee information, everything. By the end of the meeting, I understood 2 things. First, the company was worth more than most people realized. Second, Carl genuinely wanted out. Negotiations moved surprisingly fast. Within 2 weeks, we reached an agreement. The purchase included the trucks, the equipment, existing contracts, operational rights, customer accounts, and the company itself. The final price was $92,000. The morning the paperwork closed, I walked out of the attorney's office holding a folder that officially made me the owner of Iron Ridge Recovery Services. I sat in my truck afterward and laughed out loud. Not because I had some grand master plan. Honestly, even then I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing. I just knew an opportunity had appeared and I had taken it. But then the possibilities started becoming obvious. The first thing I did was review every towing record involving my tenants. Every single one. Then I authorized refunds for all fees they had paid. Some were shocked when the checks arrived. Melissa called me immediately. Wait, she said, you're telling me the towing company sent me money? Technically, yes. Why? I smiled. Because I own it now. There was silence. Then laughter. Lots of laughter. The second thing I did was review every active service contract. One contract in particular caught my attention. Ethan Whitmore's building. I instructed Robert to prepare a termination notice fully compliant with the agreement terms. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, just business. The notice was delivered 3 days later. Service would end immediately according to provisions already outlined in the contract. Completely legal, completely enforceable, completely unexpected. Then came the third step, the one that made everything feel beautifully ironic. I ordered brand new parking signs for all 10 spaces behind my building. Larger signs, brighter lettering, easier to read. At the bottom of each sign appeared the authorized towing information for violations. Iron Ridge Recovery Services. My company. 3 days after the signs were installed, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Ethan Whitmore. I answered. The first thing I heard was silence. Not because the connection was bad, because he was trying to decide how to start the conversation. Finally, he spoke. Tell me this isn't true. I leaned back in my chair. Which part? You bought the towing company? For the first time since this entire mess began, I could hear genuine uncertainty in his voice. And something told me the conversation that followed was about to become very interesting. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could practically hear Ethan trying to process what had happened. This was a man who had spent months acting like he controlled the board, only to realize somebody had quietly changed the rules of the game while he wasn't paying attention. Finally, he exhaled and said, "That's ridiculous." I laughed softly. "It's legal, though. You can't do that." "Apparently I can. The paperwork says I own the company." Another long silence followed. Then came the anger. "This is retaliation." "No," I said calmly. "Retaliation would be me doing something illegal. This is called buying a business." He started talking faster, throwing out accusations, claiming I was manipulating the situation, claiming I was abusing my position. The funny part was that every complaint he made sounded exactly like the behavior he'd been defending for months. When he finally ran out of steam, I simply said, "My parking spaces are no longer available for your confusion." Then I hung up. For the first time since the dispute began, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not victory. Not revenge. Just peace. My tenant stopped worrying about being towed. The parking lot returned to normal. Employees came and went without anxiety. Visitors parked without wondering whether their vehicles would still be there when they returned. The constant tension that had hovered over the property slowly disappeared. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed determined to keep fighting. I later learned he filed complaints with various business organizations and attempted to portray himself as the victim. None of it went anywhere. Every document supported the same conclusion. The contracts were legal. The ownership transfer was legal. The termination notice was legal. Most importantly, the parking spaces had never belonged to him in the first place. 2 months later, we finally arrived at the court hearing. By that point, I almost felt detached from the outcome. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew the facts. Robert knew the facts. The documents knew the facts. The only question was whether the court would officially recognize them. The hearing lasted most of the day. Surveyors testified. Property records were introduced. Historical maps were reviewed. Every argument Ethan's legal team had relied upon for months was carefully examined. As I sat there listening, I noticed something interesting. Their confidence was gone. The certainty they had displayed at the beginning of the dispute had faded. Reality has a way of doing that when evidence starts piling up. Near the end of the proceedings, the judge spent considerable time reviewing the original property records. The courtroom became unusually quiet. Even the attorneys stopped shuffling papers. Everyone seemed to understand that the decision was close. A week later, we received the ruling. I was sitting in my office when Robert called. The moment I heard the excitement in his voice, I knew. "We won," he said, "completely." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not because I was surprised, because I was relieved. There's a difference. Robert continued. The court found that the property boundary was clear and unambiguous. The parking spaces belonged entirely to my building. Ethan had no legal claim to them. The towing incidents were improper. His company was responsible for damages, legal expenses, court costs, and attorney fees. Altogether, the judgment exceeded $12,000. After the call ended, I sat alone in my office for several minutes. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I found myself thinking about that very first conversation in the alley months earlier. The handshake, the smile, the simple choice Ethan could have made at any point along the way. He could have apologized. He could have corrected the mistake. He could have respected a clearly marked property line. Any one of those decisions would have prevented everything that followed. But pride has a funny way of turning small mistakes into expensive disasters. A few days later, I happened to see Ethan across the street. Neither of us spoke. He looked away first. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he still believed he had somehow been wronged. Honestly, I don't know. What I do know is that the parking lot remained mine, my tenant stayed, the dispute ended, and Iron Ridge Recovery Services continued operating under new ownership. Sometimes friends ask me whether buying the towing company was part of some brilliant strategy from the beginning. The truth is much less dramatic. It wasn't some master plan. It was simply recognizing an opportunity when it appeared. Ethan thought pressure would force me to surrender something I legally owned. Instead, his actions pushed me toward an opportunity one never would have considered otherwise. Life does that sometimes. The people trying hardest to create your problems occasionally end up creating your advantages. Looking back now, the most valuable lesson wasn't about lawsuits or property rights or even business acquisitions. It was about boundaries. Healthy boundaries. Legal boundaries. Personal boundaries. When someone repeatedly crosses them and assumes you'll eventually give up, they're usually counting on exhaustion. They're betting you'll decide the fight isn't worth it. Sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're very, very wrong. And that's why I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Would you have settled early and moved on? Or would you have fought all the way to the end? And what about buying the towing company? Was that a smart business move, a little petty, or maybe a bit of both? Let me know down in the comments, because I'd genuinely love to hear where you stand on it. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates seeing arrogance run headfirst into consequences. Sometimes justice arrives in a courtroom, and sometimes it arrives with ownership papers and the keys to a tow truck.